Greetings, and welcome to this episode of PhonicsPhun. This is episode 3, where we're continuing our conversation about single consonant letters. The single consonant letters we're going to talk about today are those with minor irregularities. So our agenda is just that. We're going to talk about consonants as well as some digraphs with those minor irregularities, and what generalizations we can apply when we see those consonants and digraphs in words. By the end of this podcast, my goal is for you to have a working knowledge of the sounds associated with the letters D, F, J, N, and Z. We're also going to talk about the digraphs DG, GH, and PH. So let's get started. To contextualize, we are working our way through the alphabet. We are focusing specifically on consonants, so let's get rid of our vowels. We've also talked about those single consonants that are extremely reliable, as well as those that are very reliable. So let's get rid of those consonants that are very unreliable, and that leaves us with D, F, J, N, and Z. And these are the single consonants that have only minor irregularities. Now, because these have minor irregularities, we will see that each of these graphemes has a key symbol, and these key symbols relate to specific key words. So, when we see D, we can often be assured that that represents the sound that we associate with the first sound in the word dog. Same thing with F in fish, J in jeep, N in nut, Z and zipper. However, as I said, these letters have some minor irregularities to them. So let's start digging in. Let's start with F. When we're thinking about F, most of the time we can think that it represents the sound we hear at the beginning of the word fish. We see this in words like fiesta, and fan, and effect, and off, and if. So, given all of these words, it would seem that F is pretty regular. But here's a wrench. The word of. If you listen carefully to what's happening in the word of, that F isn't actually making the sound we typically associate with the letter. It's actually making the sound that we associate with the letter V, of. So in this instance, that F isn't making the sound we associate with it at all. Additionally, F can have some silent letter behaviors. For instance, let's listen to the words effect and off. When we say both of these words out loud, we're not saying effect, we're not saying off, we're only saying one of the two Fs. This is a reminder of the larger generalization that two like consonants appearing together in a word usually represent one phoneme. F is not immune to this particular generalization, as we see in the words effect and off. So, when you see two like consonants together, you can usually assume that they represent one sound. One of the larger, trickier things about F is not necessarily the sounds that F itself makes, but the ways in which other digraphs borrow from F's sound. And here's what I mean by that. Let's look at the word phonics as well as the word enough. If you say these words out loud, you'll notice that the PH as well as the GH make the sounds that we associate with the letter F. So in other words, they're borrowing F's sound. This is where the irregularity comes in. It's not necessarily that F in and of itself is an irregular letter, but it's the way that other digraphs utilize and borrow F's sound that can create some confusion. So let's explore this a little bit more in depth. Let's start with the notion of PH by bringing up these three words: phonics, photo, and fork. The very last word, fork, is the only one that's actually spelled with an F at the beginning. Yet all three of these words begin with the sound we associate with the letter F. In this way, we can make the generalization that the digraph PH represents the sound we associate with the key symbol F. This is a pretty generalizable statement, and we can utilize this throughout the majority of American English language. Unfortunately, the relationship between the digraph GH and F is not as clean cut. Let's look at that now. So here I've chosen 4 words: tough, night, doe, and ghost. If we rewrite each of these words, leaving the vowels where they are, and writing each of the words just with the sounds that we hear in them, we end up with tough, night, doe, and ghost. Now, when I said GH has a bit more of a sticky relationship with the sound we associate with the letter F, this is what I meant. If we're looking at GH and the sounds that GH are making in each of these words, we see in tough, it's making the sound we associate with the letter F. In night and in doe, it's completely silent. And in ghost, it's making the sound we associate with the letter G. So, what do we do? Well, let's get rid of those. And in order to bring to the surface some of these generalizations, let's get rid of tough, doe, and ghost as well. And I'm going to bring in some different words. This is bright, sight, and ought. And I want you to pay attention to the pattern that we're seeing in each of these words. And the pattern is this. The digraph GH is usually silent when followed by the letter T. In each of these words, GH as a digraph is followed by T, and it is rendered silent. We can utilize this generalization in wide ways. So, that only helps us with one part of GH. So let's look at some more GH words. These are the words high, ghost, and rough. Now, when we're thinking about whether GH is silent, makes the sound we associate with the letter G, or makes the sound we associate with the letter F, it is helpful to keep in mind this generalization. The digraph of GH is silent or represents the F sound when it appears after a vowel in a syllable, and when GH appears at the beginning of a syllable, the H in the 2-letter combination is silent. And we see this in ghost. Ghost is a 1-syllable word. It's at the beginning of the syllable, so the H is silent. Now, this is all in combination with the generalization we talked about previously, that if GH is followed by a T, the GH tends to be silent. So make sure that that gets included in your larger generalization about the digraph GH. So, enough about this particular letter. Let's move on to the letter J. And J overall is a very reliable letter. The only thing is it has one very interesting exception. And that exception is this: the word hallelujah. When we say the word hallelujah, the J actually doesn't make the sound that we associate with J at all. In this singular instance, the letter J represents the sound we associate with Y. And I say singular case because this is the only word in the American English language in which this actually happens. This is it. So it's just this. If you hear J making the sound we associate with Y, it tends to be a dialect thing. This is the only word in which the actual phonetic spelling maps in this way. But that doesn't mean that J, like F, doesn't have its problems with other digraphs borrowing its sound. So let's look at these 3 words: judge, knowledge, and edge. When we are writing these words as we hear them, the sounds that we hear in them, we end up with judge, knowledge, and edge. Each of these has the J sound at the end. That DG digraph makes the sound we typically associate with J. Now, some of you may say, Nick, when I see DG, I make the DG sound. What you could do is replace that DG sound that you are making with the J sound, and chances are you won't notice the difference. So, phonetically speaking, that tends to be the way it works. So, let's talk about this digraph DG for a minute. Let's take a quick meander. When we're talking about the digraph DG, we're talking about a very reliable digraph. It represents a sound associated with the key symbol J. This happens all the time. We saw it in the previous examples. So, let's move on to the letter D. When we're talking about D, we can normally assume that we're going to hear the sound be associated with the first sound in the word dog. Again, we see it in doll, did, day, led, and damn. But that doesn't mean that D is always as reliable as we would like it to be. So let's talk about that for a minute. Here are 3 words in which we see a bit of a pattern. Missed, hoped, jumped. When we write these words out as we hear them, with the sounds that we hear in them, here's what we end up with. Missed, M-I-S-T, hoped, H-O-P-T, and jumped, J-U-M-P-T. In this case, the D is actually making the sound that we associate with the letter T. Now, this isn't a generalization that we can make, however, that every time we see an ED, that the E is going to be silent and the D is going to make the sound we associate with T. Played, smiled, called. These all fit that generalization, however, D is making the sound that we traditionally associate with it. So this becomes a bit more of a sticky wicket. So, the way we can generalize this is that D can be silent, as it is in sudden, which, if you're paying attention, sudden is one of those words in which 2 like consonants appear together and only one is sounded. So that's the silent letter pattern for D. It can represent T as in jumped, and J as in soldier, and J as part of the digraph DG. So, D. Slightly irregular, but only minor. So let's talk about N. Again, N can be silent as in running. This goes back to that 2 like consonant generalization that we've been referencing throughout the podcasts. Additionally, it can be silent when it's preceded by M. If we think about the word him, we don't hear the N sound. The M makes all the noise for us. So aside from its silent patterns, N is a very reliable letter, with one very confusing exception. So I'm going to do my best to walk you through this very confusing exception. So, get ready. The confusing exception relates to the digraph NG. And the digraph NG represents a very specific sound. We hear it in the words sing and bring. It's not a blend, it's a sound all its own. That ng sound, NG as a digraph. However, if we think about the word think, and you stretch it out and you listen to the sounds that you're making, and if you were to represent those in key symbols, you would actually end up with this. Think. Think. We say think, we say thing and add a K to it. Crazy, right? So in this instance, that letter N is actually corresponding with the sound we associate with the digraph NG. Think. Mind blown, right? It's crazy. So, let's look at some examples, shall we? So, in your interactive learning journal, I would like you to write down the words pink, autumn, swing, thank, shrink, ring, tunnel, and trunk. And what I would like you to do once you've written those down is rewrite them, being careful to capture all of the sounds that you are saying as you read them. Take a minute. I can wait. Put me in pause. What you should be noticing is that you're seeing this same pattern where N represents the sound we associate with the digraph NG in the words pink, pink, thank, thank, shrink, shrink, trunk, trunk. That NG is there. So, N can index the sound we associate with the digraph NG. We have to be aware of that. N doesn't always index the sound we associate with the letter N. Let's look at one more example of this. And we're going to use the word finger. Within the word finger, we are seeing the digraph NG. However, it's not simply that the digraph is there. Simply because you're seeing NG doesn't mean that the digraph itself is present within the word. If we think about finger, finger is 2 syllables. There's 2 vowel sounds in it. And what we actually end up saying and hearing when we say finger is finger. So, again, in this case, because of the way the syllables are set up, and the N is at the end of the first syllable, the G is at the beginning of the second syllable, that N is representing the sounds we associate with the digraph NG, finger. So we hear an NG sound that associates with the N, and we hear the G sound that associates with that G. I told you, an extremely confusing exception, but hopefully that's illuminated it a bit for you. When we're thinking about a generalization for N is generally reliable, save for one very confusing exception. N can be silent, as in solemn, in which it's preceded by an M, or tunnel, in which 2 like consonants are traveling together. But the single consonant N can also represent ing, as in banker. Hear it? You're going to hear it everywhere now. So, very confusing exceptions for our letter N. Let's move on to Z. Z can be silent, as in buzz. And in buzz, we're seeing those 2 consonants traveling together, so only one is sounded. But can also make the sound we associate with the letter S, as in quartz, or azure, which is a digraph. ZH is a digraph, and we'll talk a lot more about that particular digraph when we hit digraphs. But azure makes a ZH sound. Honestly, I don't even know half the time if I'm making ZH sound correctly. I think so, but time will tell. So, Z. Just a few minor irregularities. The sound of S and the ZH digraph. So, let's move on to our summary. The letters D, F, J, N, and Z each have minor irregularities to them. Each consonant can represent a phoneme other than that of its key symbol. Additionally, the key symbol can be represented by a different letter or digraph. So, that concludes our single consonants with minor irregularities. Next, we're going to start talking about single consonants that are a bit more irregular. So, I will see you on the next podcast, and keep having phonics fun.